Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, Sega welcomes us to the next level, the games that came with that, and an obscure NES release. Hi, I'm your host Jared, and today is October 21st, 1992. Not quite a new generation of consoles, not quite a simple accessory. Released on October 15th, 1992, was the SEGA CD.
Hey! You still don't have a SEGA CD? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em! Want to see more?
The Sega CD is an add-on that attaches to the Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive. This allows you to play all new Sega CD games, which often boasted better graphics, CD quality sound, and lots of cinematic movies. Or, as they described it, movie graphics, rock and roll concert sound, and 3D animation. Now, in the 90s, CD-ROMs were just starting to become the standard medium for media. People were already familiar with music CDs starting in the mid-80s, but computer games being placed onto them was a pretty new thing. The Sega CD was not the first home video game console to play CD games. That would be the TurboGrafx CD, but that didn't have much of a foothold in the market. So there was tons of hype with the upcoming SEGA CD. Everyone had been talking about the SEGA CD since the middle of 1991, and everyone knew that there was going to be a new Sonic the Hedgehog CD game, even before Sonic 2 was out. And perhaps the most exciting part, the SEGA CD could play your music CDs right out of your television. That is as big of a deal as when the PlayStation 2 could play DVD movies. As the console war continued to boil, this was going to be the tipping point into Sega's favor. The actual launch of the Sega CD was nothing but problems. For one, Sega of Japan was so paranoid of leaks or technical details reaching the public or, God forbid, Nintendo, that they were incredibly secretive of the hardware. As such, Sega of America wasn't even getting development units for them to research and test until way too late. By the time they finally got actual hardware, all they had were issues. As former Sega of America producer Scott Bayless put it, some of the units would literally burst into flames. At its release, there were only 50,000 units of the Sega CD available, compared to the millions of Sega Genesises already sold in the West. There was also a severe lack of games made specifically for the Sega CD, mostly because Sega of Japan's paranoia made them too slow to get software development kits out to publishers and developers. There was also the issue of cost. The Sega CD released with a retail price of $299 US, which also required a Genesis to even use it in the first place. The games themselves didn't exactly offer too much innovation. There were lots of ports of Genesis titles like Echo the Dolphin and Batman Returns. It also had a lot of Hollywood movie games, as they put it, featuring a lot of FMVs of real actors. After all, when everyone is trying to have the best graphics possible, graphics can't get any better than real people. The games available at launch were Sewer Shark, Marky Mark, Make My Video, INXS, Make My Video, Chuck Rock, Cobra Command, and Black Hole Assault. Bundled with the unit itself was Sega Classics 4-in-1, Soul Feast, and the FMV showcase game, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. However, the Sega CD would also go on to have legendary games. Games like Snatcher, Popful Mail, Lunar Silver Story, Sonic CD. The Sega CD did have its fan base with some awesome games, assuring that the CD-ROM format was to be the standard for home video games a few years before the PlayStation made that a reality. And people may not remember the Sega CD itself, but we do remember its games for better or worse, because some of those games are infamous, with no better example than Night Trap. Night Trap was a launch title for the Sega CD in the West, releasing alongside it on October 15th, 1992. It is the perfect example of awful, cheesy FMV games that plagued the system. A bunch of teenage girls are having a sleepover, and bizarre, black-clad kidnappers or vampires break their way in to snatch them away. As a member of SCAT, you swap between numerous video feeds and activate traps found throughout the home to protect the partying women. It's basically a movie you watch pressing QuickTime event buttons to not die. It was essentially Dragon's Lair with bad pop music and 80s fashion. Development for Night Trap took only 6 months, with most of that going to filming and editing. It was also not developed for the Sega CD at all. It was originally meant for an all-new gaming console from Hasbro called ControlVision. A few games were made for the ControlVision until Hasbro abruptly canceled it in 1989, realizing that it would just be too expensive to compete against the NES. When it got canceled, this allowed the original ControlVision head developer, Tom Zito, to purchase the unreleased games to rework for the Sega CD, Sewer Shark and Night Trap. Night Trap was originally filmed in 1987, which explains why everyone looks like that. You can even find some of the prototype footage in the game itself thanks to a cheat code. At its release, Night Trap was both praised and condemned. GamePro magazine gave it incredibly high remarks, saying how even non-Sega CD gamers can see the potential of the Sega CD technology. Others realized that the gameplay is really stupid, but you can get some laughs out of the awful cutscenes. Of course, the most notable thing that Night Trap did was be a primary contributor to the creation of the ESRB. In 1993, the United States Congress held hearings about rampant video game problems, that they're all overly violent, gory, and encourage sexual violence against women. Their primary targets of these criticisms were Mortal Kombat, Lethal Enforcers, and, most infamously, Night Trap. Night Trap would later get ported to the Sega 32X, the 3DO, and the PC, all with improved graphics. It has also been placed onto many worst games of all time lists, which only made its popularity grow. A 25-year anniversary edition was then released for PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, and Nintendo Switch in 2017. Hilariously, that anniversary edition of the game that was so horrific that it created the ESRB as we know it was rated T for teen. Still getting games late into its lifespan, released this week in October of 1992, was Panic Restaurant for the NES. Panic Restaurant is a side-scrolling action platformer. You play as a chef who looks suspiciously like Mario, who has his restaurant taken over by a chef who looks suspiciously like Waluigi. You walk and jump across the stages, using all kinds of kitchenware to beat all kinds of food-based enemies. Living carrots, roasted chickens, pizzas all stand in your way until you fight whatever boss at the end of the stage, also kitchen-themed. Much like Mario, if you get hit once, you lose whatever power-up you've acquired. It's a great-looking game! It makes full use of the NES hardware for both graphics and music. It also plays solidly well, making it one of the better platformers you can find for the system. At its release, it was reviewed pretty well. Once again, GamePro gave it above average review scores. Panic Restaurant is one of the select few games from publisher Taito that was released for the NES well after the Super Nintendo hit the market. It had a limited commercial release, with some speculation that it may have been a rental-only game. Either way, Panic Restaurant is now one of the rarest NES games you can have. How rare? Well, you'll see what I mean in the Collector's Corner. But first, all the other games this week with Editor Dylan.
This week, David Crane's Amazing Tennis came out on the SNES. Who's David Crane, you ask? He's the guy who made the best game on the Atari 2600, Pitfall. But apparently he worked as a programmer on Night Trap? Wow, busy week for Mr. Crane. The Game Boy had Tom and Jerry. I guess the portable market demanded a run-of-the-mill 2D platformer starring a mouse. The other Game Boy game that came out this week was Mousetrap Hotel, a run-of-the-mill 2D platformer starring a mouse. It's loosely based on the board game that nobody actually played. Here's an extra bump of nostalgia for all you 90s kids out there.
Turn the crank, give the boot. Suddenly, we're down the chute. Move the hand, the marble drop, the dive, the flip. We just can't stop. This is zany action, a crazy contraption. The fun is catching. You wanna bite? It's Mousetrap.
Don't act like you weren't singing along. The Genesis had Gadget Twins. I guess it's technically a shoot 'em up, but a more accurate description would be baby's first shmup. The art style kind of reminds me of Plock. Remember Plock? No? Well, maybe I'll talk about it next year. A Genesis game that's not for babies is Uncharted Waters. It's a sailing, trading, simulation game that takes place during the 16th century. I got lost and starved to death in the middle of the ocean, so I think I should stick to the baby games. The last game that came out this week was Switchblade 2 on the Lynx. It's an action side-scroller with shooting, slashing, and purchasable upgrades for special attacks. It's pretty fun, but the slow pace and lack of music really bring down the experience a few pegs. Including the 10 SEGA CD games already mentioned by Jared, that leaves us with a grand total of 17 games released on these 6 consoles this week in 1992. Do I count the SEGA CD as one console or 1.5 because you need the Genesis? I don't know. We'll figure it out. But not before you get your weekly dose of Collector's Corner.
Thanks for that, Dylan. The SEGA CD hardware released with a retail price of $299 US, but it did come with 3 games. It also got 3 different models: the CD1, the cheaper CD2, and the portable CDX. For just the hardware alone, these can be worth anywhere between $180 to $500, provided, they still work. Night Trap on the SEGA CD has done okay, all things considered. It released with a retail price of $49.99, and the game alone now goes for just over $35. If you still have the weird red cardboard box and the manual, it goes up closer to $100. Panic Restaurant, however, is this week's biggest value gainer. It released with a retail price of $49.99, but is so obscure and rare that now the game alone is worth over $900, and a complete version more than doubles that. Maybe now's the time to check your closet to see if you still have it. And that's it for today. Next week, a movie game, helicopter action, and one of the rarest NES games of all time. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much. What was the first thing that you ever got to see playing on the SEGA CD? For me, I went to a friend's house and his older brother had it, and it blew my mind. He wasn't even playing a game, he was just listening to Metallica.